Kitavach, everybody. So I'll tell you, Maisa, one of the great Rebbes, one of the great Tzadikim, was the Yismach Moshe. Yismach Moshe was a forebearer of many great Tzadikim. Now, he was a chassid himself of the Chayz of Lublin, but he wasn't born into a Hasidic family. He wasn't born into the way of the Baal Shem. He was born into a little bit of a Misnagdisha family, a family that was opposed to the ways of Hasidus. Now, it was a whole journey of how the Yismach Moshe found himself by the Chayz of Lublin, but Yismach Moshe was known as a genius in learning, a huge Talmud Chacham, and the story goes that he was getting more and more involved in Pnimis HaTorah and Kabbalah, and through learning those Svarim in that aspect of Torah, he became more and more drawn to the way of the Baal Shem Tov. And the story goes that he was almost ready to make the decision to become a chassid, but there was something holding him back. There was something that was still bothering him about the way of the Baal Shem Tov, and he couldn't really get over it. And it was the following aspect. The Yismach Moshe himself was extremely sensitive to Galus, very, very sensitive to Galus. He was someone that was always longing for Mashiach, always very sensitive to the pain and the suffering of the divine presence in Galus, to the Jewish people in Galus. He was someone that fulfilled the mitzvah of mourning over the Beis Hamikdash very, very intensely. And so the Yismach Moshe was always bothered with how is it that by the Chassidim, one of the big inyanim by the Baal Shem and his students is to be b'simcha. And it always bothered him. I understand, said the Yismach Moshe, that being b'simcha is very important. I understand, but l'maisa, we're in Galus. L'maisa, there's no Beis Hamikdash. And the pain of Galus was so acute to the Yismach Moshe that it always was a big difficulty for him. If I'm going to become a chassid, how could I embrace the avodah of simcha to the fullest degree if l'maisa were in Galus? And this is something that was plaguing him and was holding him back. But at some point he decided, you know what, let me speak to one of the tzaddikim about it and we'll see what happens. So he traveled to the Chayz of Lublin. The Chayz of Lublin was one of the great tzaddikim of the time, and he figured he's going to go to the Chayz of Lublin and he'll present this question to the Chayz, and hopefully he'll get an answer or we'll make a decision from there. So when it comes to the Chayz of Lublin, when people would go to him, you didn't have to actually ask your questions. He knew. He's called the seer of Lublin for a reason. He looked at you and he knew right away what was bothering you. So the Yismach Moshe goes in as a young man, again, a Talmud Chacham, but he has in his mind this question that he's going to ask the Chayz. The Chayz sees him, and even without the Yismach Moshe saying a word, the Chayz says, let me tell you a Maisa. So, okay, so tells him Maisa. He says the following mashal. The Chayz said, he said the kings of old, for entertainment purposes, so they couldn't go to the movies or go to a ball game. One of the things that the kings of old, not just the kings, but anyone in a aristocratic person would do, was that they would go hunting for sport. That was a favorite pastime of nobility. So the Chayz said there was a mice of a king who went on a hunting trip. And when the king goes on a hunting trip, he's not wearing his royal clothing. He's wearing his, the clothing of a peasant, maybe a little bit higher than a peasant, but he's wearing hunting clothing. So he's going there with his entourage, and obviously he has a whole escort with him. The king is someone that has never really spent any time in the wild or by himself. He's born and raised in a lap of luxury, but he goes on a hunting trip. So said the Chayz, the Maisa is, the king is out there with the Chaver, and all of a sudden storm clouds come, and the sky darkens, and lightning and thunder. It becomes a torrential downpour, and it becomes even dangerous. Trees are being hit by lightning all around them. It becomes very, very frightening, and everyone starts scattering. And all the members of the entourage, they should forget that their job is to save the king, to protect the king. They're worried about themselves at that moment. So everyone scatters, and the king is never left by himself. So he figures to himself, listen, everyone's running for shelter. I'll run for shelter. So he runs. But again, he doesn't know how to deal with the forest and the wilderness. And, in thick forest and thick bush, even if you're a few feet off the path, you might not realize it. It could feel to you like you're 100 miles away. And it's you could easily get lost. So after a little bit of a while, the king is running, looking for shelter, and he finds shelter, and he waits for the storm to pass. Now this is already a bunch of hours later. By the time the storm passes, the king gets out of the thicket that he was protecting himself in. He's completely lost. Now, meanwhile, all of his entourage, they realize what they did. They're a little bit nervous about getting into trouble about that. So they sort of kind of look around, but they go home. They go back to the palace, and Nebuch, the king, is mamash by himself. So he's wandering from, through the forest. He doesn't know where he's going, what direction, until finally he finds a house. He finds a little shack. So Baruch Hashem is lucky. He goes to the shack. He knocks on the door, and this peasant opens the door, and he says, "Who are you?" And he says, "I'm the king. I need you to take me into your house. I'm the king." The peasant says, "You're the king." "Yeah, you're the fifth guy coming to my house that says he's the king. You're not the king." He closes the door in his face. So he goes to the next house, and by this point, again, he's starving, he's thirsty, he's almost, the cold is setting into his bones. It's a dangerous situation. He's by himself in the woods. Eventually, he gets to a house, knocks on the door. "I'm the king." "Baloney, you're the king." Slams the door in his face. And he keeps on going like this from house to house until finally, said the Chayza, the king goes to a certain house. He knocks on the door. The peasant opens the door, and the peasant looks at him, and the peasant says, "Oh, Your Majesty, please come on in." And the king says, "Oh, thank you so much." But then the king thinks to himself, like, "How did you know it was me?" So he says, "Oh, Your Majesty, you don't recognize me?" So the king says, "Remind me who you are. I'm so sorry." And he says, "Listen, we were children in the same class. I remember you from Cheder, from when we were little kids. You were the king. You were the prince at the time, at least. You were the prince. But we didn't really know each other so much. We didn't interact so much because I was just a peasant kid, and you were the prince. But I recognize you. I know you. And now I see you. So come on in. I'll take care of you." And the king sits down. And the whole night they're sharing stories about their youth. They're talking about their old teachers, and the old school and the old neighborhood. And the king is going through the night like this, and they're eating, they're schmoozing, they're laughing, they're having a great time. And at the end of the night, when the sun comes up and it's time for the king to get directions from the peasant to get back to the palace, the king notices that the peasant begins to cry. And the king turns to him and says, "Yankel, why are you crying?" He says, "Why am I crying? Because I'm realizing now that the whole night I was talking to the king, Mamish, the king of the entire country, in such a casual way. I feel terrible. I feel so guilty that I feel guilty for talking to you like that. And all the more, and really, what's really bothering me is seeing you this way. Is that the king? You should be wearing royal garments. You should be sitting in the palace with a throne, with an entourage protecting you, and so on. And look at you. You look like any one of us paupers, any one of us peasants. And I shouldn't cry." So the king turns to him and he says, "Listen, Yankel, I'll tell you the truth. Itaka is a bizayin. It is beneath my dignity to be in this situation. It is worthy to cry about. But I'll tell you something between me and you, Yankel. I never had a night like this that I can remember. Whenever I'm in the palace, whenever people talk to me, it's Your Majesty, the king. And they're always talking like third person. I can never truly be myself. No one is themselves with me because there's always this, air of royalty around me." But the king says to the Yankel, he says, "Yankel, this was the first time in my entire life, really, that I honestly had a normal conversation with an old friend." And he says, "Yankel, maybe it's kedai to cry over my situation, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm laughing and smiling over my situation because I know I'll get back to the palace. I'll get there. I'm not so concerned. You'll give me good directions. I'll get there. But this night that we were able to just to schmooze like old friends without having guards, without having any gabayim in between us, this is something that gave me a lot of nachas." That's what the king says. Says the Chayzit V'Yisach Moshe, "No, of course Golus is difficult. And of course there's reason to mourn and be sad over the fact that the king of all kings is walking the streets of the world like a pauper and like a peasant. But there is something to say, and there is something to celebrate over the fact that dafk in that situation, where the Rabbanu Shloim is in exile, there's something to celebrate over the fact that we have the schus of taking him into our homes and being able to talk to Rabbanu Shloim like old friends. And that's what a Jewish soul is, The Rabbanu Shloim, when a Jewish soul comes in contact with the Borei Olam, we recognize him from the old country, We recognize him from Cheder. We recognize him from what it was in Shemayim. And only the Rabbanu Shloim and us are able to talk like good old friends. When the Rabbanu Shloim was in his palace, there's already Gabayim, there's a lot of Malachim between us and him. But when the Rebbeinu Shalom is in Galus, of course we're mourning and we're sad over it, but there's something special and sweet and happy, and actually something to celebrate even, over the fact that the Rebbeinu Shalom is walking like a pauper, so to speak, and giving us the opportunity to speak to him in an open way, like good old, like friends. And there's a simcha that the Rebbeinu Shalom even has over the fact that he's spoken to in such a way of friends from the old country. And from that, the Yitzchak Moshe was able to become a chassid. Hashem should bless us that we should be zeicha to experience Geula and bring the king back to the palace. But once the king is back to the palace and Yankel comes to visit again, Yankel doesn't have to deal with all the ministers and technical details of setting up an appointment. Yankel could always go back in, because when the king looks at Yankel, he's reminded of that night in the shack when they were able just to talk like old friends. Hashem should bless us. We should be zeicha to talk to the Rebbeinu Shalom in that way, and we should give him nachas. The Rebbeinu Shalom should be makabel us with sefer panam yafas. We should be zeicha to experience a week of simcha, of nachas and bracha, ad b'li dai, v'yis kol tzedek, meher v'imenu, amen.